Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We're kind of becoming time travelers.
Yeah, going way back.
Not just centuries, but, tens, hundreds of thousands of years. We're talking deep time. And trying to piece together those earliest human stories, the landscapes.
Landscapes that were constantly changing, too.
Exactly. So our mission today is to dive into, well, a stack of sources covering ancient geology, early humans, prehistoric life, mainly focused on Western Asia and the Aegean, a really key area.
That's the plan.
Yeah.
We want to pull out the most important insights, the facts, maybe those surprising details.
Those aha moments.
Yeah, exactly. To get a clearer picture of this really distant past and, importantly, the huge changes early human societies went through.
It feels like understanding the foundations, right? Before all the later civilizations we usually talk about.
Absolutely. We're looking at the bedrock, literally, in some cases, with the geology, but also the societal bedrock.
Okay, let's start there then, with the geology, the ancient stage. Our sources really get into the deep history of the Earth's crust in this region. They talk about cratons.
Right, cratons. Think of them as the really old, stable, super rigid chunks of continents, the core parts.
And the area we're looking at is basically where these massive blocks met.
Pretty much. You've got the huge Eurasian Craton to the north, and then pieces of what used to be the giant supercontinent, Gondwanaland, to the south.
Gondwanaland, that rings a bell.
Yeah.
Africa, Arabia.
Africa, Arabia, India's Deccan Plateau. They were all part of it before it broke apart over, millions and millions of years.
Wow, so these pieces drifted.
Drifted, collided, and the forces involved were just immense. That's how we get what the sources call the Midworld Orogenic Belt.
Orogenic belt. Sounds technical. Mountain building.
Exactly, but think huge scale. This belt formed in the Tertiary period, basically from the sediments of the old Tethys Sea getting crumpled up between these colliding continents.
And it stretches how far?
Incredibly far. The sources say from Gibraltar, basically, all the way to Singapore.
That's mind-boggling. Mountains formed across half the world from this slow-motion collision.
It really is. And then on top of these massive geological forces, you've got climate shifts, big ones, glaciations, pluvial periods.
Ice ages, basically, and wet periods.
Yeah, glaciations are the ice ages, mostly hitting the higher latitudes. Pluvial periods were wetter times in warmer regions, often happening around the same time as the ice ages further north.
Okay, so how did these global changes play out in, say, Western Asia and the Aegean?
Well, they had a huge impact. The sources mention snow lines and tree lines dropping dramatically in the mountains. Meaning areas that might be forests or pastures today, like the Armenian and Kurdish plateaus, could become these really harsh, uninhabitable alpine zones during cold spells. Too cold, too high.
Definitely. The sources give some numbers: highland temperatures, maybe 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit, cooler on average. Even the eastern Mediterranean sea surface could be about 9 degrees colder, between roughly 28,000 and 10,000 BC. Wow, that's a significant drop. So much colder, drier generally.
Colder, yes, but the climate wasn't the same everywhere. That's a key point in the sources.
Oh, different regional impact.
Totally. Like the Nile Valley apparently had a really tough, unfavorable climate phase much later, around 2350 to 500 BC. And the wet periods, the pluvials in the Mediterranean, weren't as intense as the ones happening down in equatorial Africa at the same time.
So it's complex, a patchwork of conditions.
A real mosaic, yeah.
Ah.
And just quickly on geology, the Jordan Rift Valley, that big crack in Palestine.
Yeah.
The sources note its major movements were mostly done by the early Pleistocene. So while it's a dramatic feature, it was already kind of ancient history by the time of the later human stuff we're focusing on.
So the deep geology sets the stage, and then climate adds layers of change that people had to deal with.
Exactly. Which brings us to, who were these people? Who was navigating this shifting world?
Right. The early humans. The sources mention quite a few different groups, don't they?
They do. You get mentions of really early ancestors like Australopithecus, Homo habilis, sort of setting the deep background. But for the periods leading up to settled life, the focus is more on Denisovans, Neanderthals, and early Homo sapiens.
Denisovans. They're pretty new on the scene, discovery-wise. What do the sources say about them?
Well, they were widespread across Asia, apparently. And crucially, they interbred with early modern humans.
That mixing is always fascinating.
It's more than just fascinating, it's key. The sources specifically suggest this mixing might have provided real advantages, like maybe helping modern Tibetans survive at high altitudes.
So interaction, not just replacement. Genetic sharing that actually helped us adapt.
Precisely. It shows a much more complex picture of how different human groups interacted.
Okay, and then Neanderthals. The classic caveman image, but the sources paint a different picture.
A much more nuanced one, yes. There's mention of speculation about maybe limitations in their vocal ability.
The old idea they couldn't speak properly?
Right. But the sources argue pretty strongly against that based on the archaeology. I mean, look what they were doing.
Like what?
Living in large groups, coordinating really complex hunts, taking care of their sick and injured, burying their dead. The argument in the sources is you just don't do all that complex social stuff without sophisticated communication, without language.
That makes sense. You need to plan, coordinate.
Exactly. So the evidence points towards them having speech and language. That's the main takeaway here.
And then there's us, Homo sapiens. The sources say it's still debated exactly when and where we emerged.
Yeah, the precise origin point is controversial. But they do mention specific signs, like the Swanscombe and Steinheim skulls in Western Europe.
Suggesting what?
Suggesting possibly a very early emergence there, maybe as far back as the Mindel-Riss interglacial age. It's one piece of the puzzle, one line of evidence the sources discuss.
And they even float an idea about Neanderthal-like groups surviving late in Egypt.
It's mentioned as a possibility, yeah. Speculative but maybe culturally isolated groups hung on until Mesolithic times. It just reminds you the past wasn't neat lines on a map. It was messy, varied region by region.
Okay, so we have this vast, geologically active region, changing climates, diverse human groups adapting, interacting. Now here's where our sources say things get really transformative. The Great Transition.
Right, that huge shift from everyone being mobile hunter-gatherers to settled life, farming, new technologies. And Western Asia seems to be where it really kicks off first, according to these texts.
Not overnight, though.
Definitely not. The sources frame it as a radical readjustment, driven by ecological changes after the last ice age ended.
Climate again.
Yeah. As things warmed up, environments changed. Mesolithic groups in Southwest Asia basically had to figure out new ways to live. And that eventually led them towards domesticating animals and plants.
Okay, let's get specific. The sources dive into different regions. How about Palestine first, the Natufian culture?
The Natufians are really interesting. They date back to the Mesolithic, before full-blown farming. Sites around the Wadi in Natuf are key. They lived in caves, but also open-air sites.
And how did they live? Still hunting?
Oh yeah, keen gazelle hunters, the sources say. But plants were clearly becoming super important.
How do we know? What's the evidence?
The big thing is these reaping knives they find with sickle sheen.
Sickle sheen.
It's this polish, like a gloss, that forms on flint tools when you cut grasses or cereals over and over again.
Ah, okay. So they were harvesting grains.
Whether they were cultivating them yet or just harvesting wild stands intensively is debated. But the knives, plus lots of pestles and mortars, some huge ones carved right into rock outcrops, it all points to cereals being a big part of their diet, processing serious amounts of plant food.
And signs they were staying put, not just seasonal camps.
That's the other key thing, indicators of fixity of settlement, staying in one place longer. Large cemeteries, you don't tend to have big permanent cemeteries if you're constantly moving. Burying your dead in one place suggests a connection, a commitment to that spot. The sources even wonder if the idea of the reaping knife came to the Natufians from maybe earlier plant-using centers further east, like Kurdistan, shows early connections.
And the Natufians kind of paved the way for the next stage in Palestine.
Seems like it. That Natufian camp at Jericho, around 7800 BC, the sources see it as a likely forerunner to the proper farming villages of the Neolithic period there.
Which had phases too, right? Something about pottery or lack of it.
Exactly. First, there's this Neolithic without pottery phase. Sites like Jericho, Abu Ghosh, you see more substantial rectangular houses made of stone, specific flint tools, but no pots yet.
Huh. Settled farming life before pottery. That's interesting.
It is. It shows things didn't all develop at once. Then later, you get the Neolithic with pottery, where different styles appear, and maybe changes in housing too, like pit dwelling sometimes. The whole package evolves.
Okay, moving on chronologically. The Chalcolithic period in Palestine, Copper Stone Age. But you said copper wasn't common at first.
Right. The name's a bit misleading initially.
Yeah.
You get the Gasulian culture, interesting stuff like underground houses at Beersheba, weird burial practices like plastering skulls at Tel Ramad.
Yeah.
But not much metal early on.
But then, the big find, that Nahal Mishmar hoard.
Ah, yes. That changes the picture dramatically for the later Chalcolithic. Hidden in a cave, this incredible stash, over 400 objects, mace heads, wands, axes, chisels, these elaborate crowns.
Made of?
Mostly copper. plus some ivory things. It's astonishing. Dates to this period, it shows seriously sophisticated metalworking skills existed, even if copper wasn't used for everyday stuff yet. And it suggests someone, some group, was accumulating serious wealth, maybe for rituals. Points to complex society.
Okay, let's shift east. Mesopotamia and Iran, Zagros foothills. The sources mention early stuff there, too.
Yeah, back into the Paleolithic, Mousterian, Zarzian, specific stone toolkits from earlier groups.
And then the transition to settled life there happens through periods like Ubaid.
Right, the Ubaid period in Mesopotamia. The sources suggest it lasted a long time. Key sites are Eridu,
And what do we see there? What defines Ubaid?
Well, you start seeing the first real temple architecture. Suggest organized religion, maybe community centers. They find clay sickles again, pointing to farming. And the sources suggest maybe even early irrigation was starting, which would be vital down on those dry plains.
Makes sense. And after Ubaid comes Uruk.
Yes, Uruk period known for its red and gray pottery. And it leads into the Jamdat Nazir phase.
Why is that phase important?
Because, according to the sources, Jamdat Nazir is the end phase of Uruk, and it's when writing emerges.
Writing. Okay, that's a massive step.
Huge. The earliest script mentioned is from Uruk level IVB, roughly 3500 to 2800 BC. And interestingly, it pops up around the same time as monumental architecture.
Suggesting a link.
Seems likely. Bigger, more complex societies, maybe early cities. You need ways to keep track of things, records, administration. That seems to be the driver for inventing writing, based on this evidence.
And the buildings themselves were distinctive.
Yeah, the sources mention these tripartite temple plans, central hall, rooms on 3 sides, and they note links, like similar plans found at Gara up north and Eridu way down south, suggests shared ideas, connections.
What about artifacts? Those Gara figurines sound unique.
They really are, according to the descriptions. Little painted clay figures, often a squatting mother goddess type, sometimes shown veiled, and they all have these funny peg-shaped heads. Very different from other fertility figures. Gives you a sense of regional art styles, maybe beliefs. And the painted pottery everywhere is crucial for dating and tracking cultural links.
And metallurgy in Iran, earlier than Mesopotamia.
That's what the sources suggest. At places like Sialk, they find hammered copper way down in the earliest levels. Later, they figure out annealing, heating it, and casting.
Why earlier in Iran?
Simple geography, really. Iran's got the metal-bearing highlands. Mesopotamia is an alluvial plain, great for farming eventually, but no native copper. So the Iranians likely got access to metal and started working it sooner.
Makes sense. Okay, let's hop over to the islands. Cyprus. Sounds like it was off on its own for a long time.
Very much so, according to the sources.
Yeah.
Long periods of isolation before people really mastered reliable sea travel. So it's early Neolithic, like at Karakitia, around 5800 BC, is really distinct.
How so? What was unique?
The houses, for one. Circular stone structures called tholoi, and their burial practices were very specific.
Go on.
They buried people tightly curled up right under the house floors and often put heavy stones on top of the body.
The stones.
The sources speculate maybe it was ritualistic to keep the dead from stirring or coming back. Who knows for sure, but it's distinctive. And their little human statues were stylized, not like the typical mother goddess figures elsewhere.
But then there was a gap, a break in the record.
Yeah, this is a puzzle mentioned in the sources. The radiocarbon dates seem to show a gap of maybe 1,500 years between Karakitia being abandoned and the start of the next Neolithic phase, Neolithic II, around 3,500 BC at sites like Sotira.
1,500 years, that's huge.
It is. The sources throw out the idea of maybe some big natural disaster that made the island uninhabitable for a long time before new people arrived with different traditions, like pottery. Metal use comes much later on Cyprus.
Okay, last region, the Aegean, Greece and Crete. Early Neolithic on the mainland, Greece. When was that?
Around the 6th millennium BC, the sources say. And the style is different again. Here you get rectangular houses, usually mud brick, often on stone foundations. Sites like Neanderthals show this.
Any interesting details there?
Yeah, things like wall slots, buttresses, architectural features. And there's talk of maybe a larger central building at Neanderthals could have been for the chief or for rituals, perhaps.
And burials, similar across Greece.
Seems so for this period. Flexed burials in pits right inside the settlements. Usually not many grave goods. You see this pattern from Macedonia down south. Suggests shared customs. And the pottery shows connections too. Certain styles, like barbatineware or cardiumware that's pottery decorated by pressing things, sometimes shells, into the wet clay, these styles are found up into Yugoslavia. Suggests ideas, or maybe even people, moving north-south.
And Crete, what was happening there in the late Neolithic?
At Knossos, you see a more complex, multi-room building, hearths inside. Pottery styles change, less of the older rippled stuff, more lighter colors, pattern burnishing comes in. And you get the first hints of metal use. A copper axe was found. Plus stone bowls that look a bit like ones from pre-dynastic Egypt.
Egypt, so potential sea contacts.
Hints of it, yeah. Early trade across the Med. Though the sources also mention it gets complicated dating the later Cretan sites, places like Phaistos. People debate whether to call it late Neolithic, sub-Neolithic, Chalcolithic. Reflects those transition periods again.
Okay, that's a lot of detail across many places. Pulling it together relies on dating. How do researchers figure out the timelines, according to the sources?
Well, it's basic archaeology, mostly. Stratigraphy is fundamental, looking at the layers. Lower layers are older, generally, like reading pages in a book.
Right.
And crucially, radiocarbon dating. That gives absolute dates for organic stuff, charcoal, bones found in those layers. That's where we get the BC numbers from.
And they link different sites by comparing stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially pottery styles.
Yeah.
If you find the same distinctive pot design at site A and site B, even if they're far apart, it's a good clue they were occupied or at least interacting around the same time. It helps build those chronological correlations across regions.
And the sources emphasize this wasn't just isolated bubbles of people, there were connections.
Definitely. Real connectivity, not just ideas spreading like pottery fashions or maybe that reaping knife concept moving west, but actual movement of goods.
Like what?
Well, they mentioned a possible prehistoric trackway in the Jebel Sinjar, linking northern Iraq and Syria, and finding materials far from their source, like obsidian, that volcanic glass good for sharp tools. Finding it in Palestine means it was traded or carried from volcanic areas, maybe hundreds of miles away.
Right. Or the copper from Iran ending up elsewhere.
Exactly. Native copper came from specific highland sources and got moved around. That implies trade networks, travel, knowledge exchange between these early communities.
The sources even bring in linguistics as another layer.
They do touch on it, looking at the deep history of language families, like Afro-Asian or Indo-Hittite.
Can you connect those directly to the archaeology?
It's really complex, as the sources point out. Languages change so much over thousands of years. So drawing a direct line from, say, Proto-Indo-Hittite speakers to a specific pot style is, well, usually not possible. But linguistics still gives context about the long-term population history of the region. It's another piece of the puzzle, even if it doesn't perfectly map onto the archaeological cultures we've discussed.
So quite a journey then. From the deep geology and climate setting the stage, through the different early human groups, and then really diving into this incredibly complex, varied, but also connected transition to settled life, farming, early complex societies across this whole huge area of Western Asia and the Aegean.
Yeah, we've pulled out details from the sources on landscape change, human adaptation, new technologies popping up, societies getting more complex, evidence of early trade.
Yeah.
It's all in there.
It really is a story told through, well, fragments, isn't it? Bits of stone, broken pots, old bones, the dirt itself.
But when you piece those fragments together, using the kind of research presented in these sources, you start to see this really compelling picture of some of humanity's earliest, biggest leaps forward.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it? How much of what we take for granted today, living in one place, farming, complex societies, even writing, organized religion, has roots stretching way, way back to these incredibly diverse, interconnected developments we've just skimmed the surface of.
Absolutely. What lessons are there maybe about adapting to change, about innovation, about how societies organize themselves? Things we can still ponder today, looking back at this incredibly deep past.